Good evening. This week we'll be reading Parshat Vayigash. In Parshat Vayigash we have an incredible reconciliation that takes place between Yosef and 10 of his brothers. We see this in the beginning of the Parsha with Yehuda and Yosef coming together in this confrontation, and eventually Yosef reveals his identity, and there is this healing, this reconciliation that takes place. If we think about the circumstances, this is a most improbable event. Yosef's brothers first were going to kill him, then they threw him into a pit, according to Rashi, full of snakes and scorpions. Then they sold him. Eventually he becomes a slave in Egypt. Yosef goes through all the trials and difficulties that he has in Egypt, and yet we find that there is this incredible reconciliation. One of the things that is most striking to me in my work as a chaplain is how often, when I'm working with a family, there's some sort of rift or conflict between different family members. And these things come out very acutely sometimes at the end of life. And it is an incredibly common phenomena. And it is very hard for people to forgive and to reconcile. And I think we can learn an incredible lesson from what happens with Yosef and his brothers, because while there are many situations where there are rifts and tensions and fights and jealousy and hurt feelings, rarely does it rise to the level of conflict that Yosef had with his brothers. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrib, the executive director emeritus of the OU, writes that there were three things that really allowed this conflict to be resolved and to be reconciled. And quite in fairness, it's never 100% reconciled in this story, but to the level that it was. And these three things were, one, on the side of the brothers, in last week's Parsha, after Yosef, as the viceroy, and they don't really realize it's Yosef, says to them, you have to bring back your brother Binyamin, and I'm going to hold Shimon as a hostage until you do that. They say to each other, alas, we are at fault, because we looked on at his anguish, meaning Yosef's anguish, yet paid no heed as he pleaded with us. They acknowledge and regret. They acknowledge what they've done, and they regret it. Clearly, Yosef played some role in what went wrong, but the brothers are primarily the ones who've done something against Yosef, and they need to be able to recognize that they were wrong and regret their actions. However, on the side of Yosef, it's also not so simple. Rabbi Weinrib points out that Yosef is a really special figure, that in our story, we are told on 4 separate occasions that he begins crying. And Yosef begins crying because it shows that his emotional sensitivity, his openness to his brothers. Yosef has not become hardened and embittered. Rather, he wants a reconciliation. This is the second key element. And the third, and I think the most remarkable about this story, is how Yosef is able to reframe what has happened to him. And this is based upon his religious ideology. Yosef, we see in this Parsha, tells the brothers that it's ultimately not them who's brought this about, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one who controls a person's circumstances and their destiny. And he says to them, so it was not you who sent me, but God. Hashem sent him. That's his ideology. That's his world. That's how he reframes the terrible events that have happened to him, to understand that ultimately there was a reason for what happened, and that God is running the world, and that the brothers are certainly they're responsible for their actions, but at the end of the day, that God is the one who's in control. And by looking at it in this manner, Yosef is able to forgive his brothers. And while we are not, I would say most of us, able to quite rise to the level of Yosef, to the degree that we can share a little bit of his ideology, a little bit of his willingness to be open and forgive those who have wronged us, and to recognize that ultimately what happens to us in this world is something that is controlled by Hashem, and that each and every one of us has a unique fate, a unique destiny, and that while others retain responsibility for their actions, we should look at it in terms of that Hashem has a plan for each and every one of us. And with this, hopefully, we are able to forgive people when they wrong us. Just think in the global sense, we are clearly living in a world at a time of great din, a time of great judgment, and that our sages tell us that Hashem responds to us mida keneged mida, and the way to bring rachamim, to bring mercy into the world, is for us to be merciful one to another, for us to be forgiving, to be able to reconcile when there's wrongs and hurt that have happened in the past. We can bring a change of din, of judgment, of strict judgment, to a change to rachamim, to mercy into the world. And I pray that all of us are able to reconcile with those with which we are in conflict, and that we are able to bring mercy, rachamim, into the world. I wish everyone a good night.